Alright, I'm back with another Road to 2200 Rapid rating on chess.com. I'm going to run through two games in this video, another bad game and then a good game. So let's just try and get through these quickly and try and learn something. So we got pawn to d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, and I played a Benoni with pawn to c5, striking at the center. White goes pawn to d5, we trade, I go pawn to d6, and I'm going to look to fianchetto this bishop on the long diagonal. All standard Benoni stuff so far. Knight c3, g6, e4, bishop g7, bishop e2, castle, castle. All normal stuff so far. I go a6, looking to expand with b5, and white stops that with a4. I go rook to e8, target this pawn on e4. White goes knight to d2, defending this pawn on e4, but also looking to potentially reposition the knight to c4 at the right moment. Also look to potentially play f4. I go pawn to b6 since I can't go b5. Rook b1's kind of an unusual move. Maybe at some point white wants to play b4, or maybe just get this rook off the long diagonal. It's kind of a prophylactic move. I go knight d7, b3, queen c7. Queen c7 might not be the best move, but I think it's a logical move in a lot of lines to look to play pawn to c4, potentially give up a pawn and play knight c5. Also just develop the queen, look to play bishop b7, maybe double the rooks. But queen c7 isn't necessarily the worst move. The engine prefers knight h5, which is kind of not a human move because of this. Queen takes h5 is played, then bishop takes c3 happens, so that's the whole idea of knight h5. I really just have to take advantage of the fact that b3 was played undefending this knight, but once again, not the easiest move to play. So instead of that, it was queen to c7, bishop b2, bishop b7, just normal developing moves, and I make a mistake here. I play knight takes d5. So my idea here was that after e takes d5, I can play bishop takes c3, and then after a recapture, let's say bishop takes c3, I can just take this bishop back, and then bam, I'm up a pawn. Now I totally made a mistake here because queen takes c3 comes with a greater threat, a mate in one threat, so I don't have time to recapture this bishop, so I would actually be losing in that case. So knight takes d5, no good. This move should just be losing a piece, but unfortunately for me, my opponent kind of believed my sacrifice. Better would have been something like rook to e7 and double the rooks. But my opponent kind of believes me, and he plays knight takes d5, and then I play bishop takes d5. So once again, taking advantage of this pin down the e-file, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and white plays a desperado here. So white knows that after e takes d5, I'm going to win this bishop. So white chooses to give the bishop up to gain another pawn. And the thing is, in this position, I can do another desperado. So it's like a double desperado. Bishop takes b3. So instead of taking his bishop and then he takes my bishop back, I give my bishop up for another pawn. And then after queen c3 check, it doesn't really change a whole lot. King g8. He chooses to save his bishop rather than take my bishop. I'm not really sure. I think queen takes b3 was probably better, but bishop b5 makes some sense to keep some pieces on the board because he's down material. So I play bishop takes a4 though here, so I win another pawn, so maybe that was a bit of a dangerous decision on his part to allow that. Bishop to c4 was played, knight to e5, bishop d5, and I drop the bishop back. So I'm looking for trades now because I'm up 2 pawns in this position, but white goes f4, which is a little bit uncomfortable. I go knight d7, but white still has some play on these dark squares because I have Swiss cheese dark squares around my king. Also e5 could be coming, f5 could be coming. White definitely has some chances, but I know I'm better in this position. Knight c4 is played, putting some pressure on b6. Also looking to play e5 at the right time, maybe reposition the knight to e3. I play b5, knight e3, and I kind of make a mistake here with knight b6. Better would have been c4, maybe look to play knight c5, something along those lines. but unfortunately I go knight b6, and this is kind of a bad move because it loses sight of some of the critical squares around my king. So my king's kind of naked right now with this Swiss cheese dark squares in front of it, and knight g4 is suddenly kind of a big problem here. Knight h6 check is a threat, knight f6 check is a threat, and it's kind of hard to deal with it. So I go knight back to d7, thinking, oh, I can defend f6, but I completely forgot about knight h6 check, and then my position just completely collapses here. So I just start like throwing material, hoping that I don't get mated here. End up having to give back a knight, but my knight is hanging and this bishop is hanging, so this is not going to be good. And my rook was hanging on e8. This is, I mean, it's just a mess. My position's falling apart. But it all just stemmed from me missing that knight h6 check was a threat. But it stems from me initially moving this knight away to b6, and then my king just was way too weak. So unfortunately, my position just collapses here, and then shortly after, the game simplified to a position where I am down a rook. And unfortunately, I was not able to gain any ground here. And after king to d3, I simply just resigned because I'm just down a rook. This pawn is not going to be a threat at all. So not a horrible game. There were a couple miscalculations, particularly with this knight takes d5. When you're making a move like this, you need to make sure that it is pristine and does not have any holes in it. And he kind of believed me, but unfortunately, this whole scheme does not work because I can't take the bishop back. So I would just be losing a piece. And then later on, I just need to be better about my king safety. So playing knight to b6 here, my king kind of runs into some issues along these dark squares since I don't have a dark square bishop. But overall, not the worst game. Had an advantage, and then I, unfortunately threw it away. But that's just how it goes sometimes. But not the worst game, and on to the next one. Okay, in this game I was playing a 2167. I have the black pieces yet again. This was a pretty crazy game, actually. So pawn to e4, and I played g6. So I go with the modern defense, looking to fianchetto my dark square bishop on the long diagonal, letting white get a big center if he wants to. Knight f3, bishop g7, d4, d6, and pawn to c3. So this is a pretty good setup against the modern defense. You really make this bishop kind of bite into a rock. This pawn structure is very, very solid, and it's very hard to crack. So knight d7, just looking to play e5, maybe c5, but generally in this structure you want to look to play e5 more so than c5, since this pawn center is very, very strong. It's not really all that useful if you're playing c5 and trading, so that white just gets a big center. The knight on d7 is not particularly useful. Usually you look to play knight d7, e5, knight e7, and then I like those setups. Bishop d3 is played, pawn to e5, castle, knight e7, bishop to e3, and I play h6 here. So my main idea is I actually want to play pawn to g5, and it's going to be even better if white goes h3. I really want to go g5, knight g6, maybe knight f4, something along those lines. Then I can figure out what I want to do with this knight so I can get this bishop into the game. But pretty solid, provocative way of playing. White goes knight bd2, just a super, super solid setup that white has adopted. This is a good way to play against the modern. I go pawn to g5. I'm trying to be aggressive here. White goes h3, stopping pawn to g4, kicking the knight. I go knight g6. And white goes knight to h2. So white is moving the knight away so that at the right time he can break with pawn to f4, maybe look to play knight g4 at the right time. But it's kind of a multi-purpose move. I go pawn to h5, keeping the knight out of g4, but also maybe looking to play g4 at some point myself. It might have been better to go knight f4 right away, but h5 is a very solid move, very aggressive move. Queen to b3, kind of an unusual move here, but it makes a lot of sense. White wants to open up the f-file. So if I go g4, white is going to go f4 and then really try and hammer on f7 and try and get this rook opened up. So definitely something I need to keep in mind. And I go g4. So this was kind of my plan the whole time. And white goes f4. So if white chooses to take this pawn here a couple times, this is not going to go well. Queen h4 is a pretty good option, I would say. f3, and then I think I just have really good play here. The engine seems to favor me. White has to be comfortable with booking it with the king at the right time, but I can really just continue to build my attack. I can play something like bishop f6 and look to play bishop g5 and try and trade the bishops. And if bishop to f6 and the knight takes, then my knight comes into the game, and this knight is no longer around to defend the king, and white's king is a little bit shaky over here. In the game, instead of taking on g4, white plays pawn to f4. So I think I have to be really, really careful here, and I was not. I need to play bishop to h6 and try and pin this pawn, and then look to take on f4. Or I should look to take on f4, and after bishop takes f4, probably just play queen e7 here, or play knight takes f4. Knight takes f4 is possible, but it looks kind of dicey, because then at the end, a lot of pressure is going to be on f7. So I think queen e7 is probably the best move here, but even that looks a little bit dicey. So in the game, I tried to complicate things. I tried to complicate things because I really didn't love my position all that much, so I played e takes d4, which looks kind of counterintuitive because it gives white a big center, and the engine hates it, but I really just wanted to take on h3 and then try and hang on. g3 is a good move, keeping everything closed over here, so I don't really have an attack. And then I go knight f6. f5 is played, knight back to e7, and pawn to e5. So this was kind of a natural continuation of what white was doing. He's really just trying to roll me. So I take, and after take, the critical move that I need to play here is queen to d5 to try and unwind that way. And the idea is that I'm threatening mate in one, and there's really not too many great ways to deal with it. If queen takes d5, I can take with the knight on f6, and then I hit the bishop on e3, and I get just enough counterplay. I'm hitting the pawn on e5. I really have a nice position here. But I miss queen d5 with the mate in one threat. Alternatively to queen takes d5, which probably isn't the best move, I think rook f3 or rook f2 or something like that might have to be played. But I missed queen to d5. Instead, I played knight fd5. And the engine thinks f6 is really, really strong here. I was really banking on knight takes e3 here, but it's really not going to be looking too good because after f takes g7, rook g8, queen takes f7, my king is just going to get smoked here, I think. This looks very, very scary. I'm probably not going to survive. So f6 was really a missed opportunity by him, and I think he got scared by my threat on his bishop, and he plays bishop to c5. I should probably play bishop takes e5 here. I'm not really sure why I didn't. I inserted bishop to h6, which I'm not really sure how I can look at that bishop and not think about the pawn that's hanging right in front of it, but oh well. I play bishop h6 and knight to c4. So better was knight to e4. Probably threaten knight f6 check in the right position. Maybe it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to tell why knight e4 is better than knight c4. I think knight e4, I guess if bishop e3 check, take, what's the big idea at the end? Bishop to b5 check. And then I guess I got to move the king probably. If I play c6, knight d6 is going to be crushing. And if I do something, there's also knight f6, so it's really hard to say. Bishop e3 also might not be the best move, but surprised that it says knight e4 is so much stronger than knight c4, because knight c4 seems like a reasonable move, but it seems to think that his advantage slips quite a bit. And I play b6, the best move, so I really want to kick the bishop back and then figure out what to do from there. But he actually chooses to play bishop takes e7, and after queen takes e7, I actually have a pretty nice position because I'm Now I'm threatening queen to c5 check, and his king is starting to feel a little bit of pressure here. He goes pawn to e6. I go bishop to b7, not quite the most accurate. I think it would have been better to either take on e6. I wasn't really considering that, but queen c5 check right away is probably a pretty good move. But bishop e7 makes a lot of sense. Put the bishop on the long diagonal, and I have queen c5 on the next move. E takes f7, and then if you let the engine think for a little bit, it pretty much says king takes f7 and king f8 are the same. But I chose to play king f8. I really just want to hide behind this umbrella pawn on f7. Rook to e1 was played, queen c5 check. So rook e1 was not the best move. I guess the critical defensive move was knight f3. I presume probably to free up the h2 square for the king, since none of the king's current flight squares are very safe with this bishop on the long diagonal. So knight f3 would have been a good defensive move, but he plays rook fe1, and then queen c5 check. King has to go to f1. Can't go to h1 or you're going to get crushed by some discovered attack. So king f1. And I thought for a while here, I thought for like minute and 20 seconds, and just played rook d8, which actually turns out to be a pretty good move, but I didn't really know what to do here, so I just wanted to make a natural developing move and kind of toss the ball back in white's court and see what he wanted to do. I'm kind of x-raying this bishop on d3, might look to play knight b4 and hit it again. Might look to move this knight and then play bishop g2 check. There's really a lot of good ideas, but this rook is just good on an open file. So I figured it couldn't be that bad of a move. I guess h4 was also a good move to consider to break things open, but rook d8, pretty good move. Rook c1, looking to potentially trade off some pieces and cause some chaos, but that's just a free rook, I think. So I go knight b4 actually. So yeah, this rook is hanging, but also now this bishop on d3 is very hanging, and white has a lot of hanging pieces here. It's going to be very problematic. I'm also introducing bishop g2 check to the equation, and I think white just has too many problems to deal with. I think the best thing to do is probably play rook e8 check and then go for a position like this, try and move the rook out of the way, king d8, and then I think this is just still at the end of the day not looking so great because the king is not so safe for white. White's king is suddenly weaker than black's king, but this might be survivable after queen f3, but it just looks like black has the upper hand here, up 2 pawns, and it's looking pretty good here. I guess rook f8 is probably a good move, but regardless, rook to e8 check was not played in the game. It was knight e3, just allowing rook takes d3, but the idea was to block this diagonal and also hit my queen, but unfortunately rook takes d3 is just going to be good enough. Queen takes d3 was tried. It's pretty much the same. Rook takes c5, rook takes b3. It's all going to be pretty good for black. I think at the end, black is just going to be up a piece in most of these lines. So rook takes d3. In the game, it was queen takes d3, knight takes d3, rook takes c5, and knight takes c5. And then if you take stock of material, black is currently up a minor piece and a pawn. So I have 2 bishops and a knight, and he has 2 knights. It's going to be good enough for the win. A couple more moves are played. Knight c4, I pin it, just looking to trade more pieces. And then he throws this random rook e6 check in and takes it. But even without that, this is going to be a conversion for a win, most likely. But pretty good game. I had a somewhat suspect position there, somewhere in the middle here, after d takes e5. After I missed queen d5 here, knight f d5, f6 could have been pretty decisive for white, but after that, the game kind of turned around once I got active along these diagonals towards his king. So it was a good way to complicate the game and get some counterplay. But not the most accurate game, but it was very chaotic and a pretty fun game. So good to get a win against a strong player, 2167, and the rating is sitting at 2154. I had one game where I played a cheater, so it got some rating points back. But overall, doing pretty well and looking to win some more games. And I will see you guys in the next video.